one of the very exciting things is about landscape architecture is that we are often surrounded by built projects, whether we know it or not. And a lot of landscape architectural projects, especially I would say in the past 15 years, sorry, you're all very young, but anyway, in the past 15 years have been very, very important to how cities and communities reorganize around them, and how natural systems are reintroduced into our built environment. They're quite important. Thank you. Irvin, would you like to share, or are you done talking?
No, I can talk. So when I was in the student's shoes, right, the prospective student's shoes, I was choosing between different courses. I knew when I was young that I wanted to do something art related. Of course, I knew I want to be a fine artist, right? And design was something that I was interested in. So when I was shopping around for courses, there was architecture, and I kind of like nature, so I was also environmental engineering. So I put architecture and then environmental engineering as a second choice. These two are very, very, very different courses. Right? Architecture is very design focused. Environmental engineering is actually very mathematical, right? Of course, I didn't know at the time. I got into architecture after the interview. I excelled at it. I was very good. I was one of the best students there. But it's something about it I just didn't enjoy, right? I went for an internship, and then that really kind of like was the final nail in the coffin. I was like, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, this is not for me. This is not something that I can do for the rest of my life. So I took a little bit of a break. I actually went to become a photographer for a while. I love landscape photography, of course. And at this point in time, I had no idea what landscape architecture was. I never heard about it. Nobody actually introduced it to me, even in my 3 years of education in architecture. Until I came across the papers, and then there was a call for a scholarship to go back and do a master's. So that was at the start of the Masters of Landscape Architecture program. So long story short, I kind of went for the briefing, introducing it. At the time was a previous program director. And then I was like, oh, why wasn't this like, available when I was an undergrad? This is like exactly what I want, learning from nature, designing with nature, and then at the same time, it's it's not a fine art degree. At the same time, it's there's some science and some things about it. Yeah, so I went for the masters, and then one thing led to another, and then here I am, kind of teaching landscape architecture, because again, I believe in the profession, I believe in the discipline, and I believe that we are one of the disciplines that will have a positive impact as we start to tackle some of the environmental issues in the world. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. And that's also a characteristic that I see a lot in professionals as well as graduates from either BLA or MLA programs here and throughout the world, which is that people are very passionate about what they do. There's a great level of care and a great level of commitment to the issues that we're interested in, whether it's about public space, whether it is about sort of thinking through ecological systems and rethinking our relationship to natural systems, or in terms of how it relates to different communities and societies. So I think that that is definitely something that bonds us all together as a profession. All right, so we're going to move on to the next question to the panel. And I was wondering, since there are some prospective students here, I was wondering if you could share 3 things that every landscape architect should know. Okay, so these are for Kenya and Irvin. And I think for Latif and Charisse, I was going to ask you, what are 2 things you have learned about landscape architecture that surprised you at NUS, and what is one thing that you wish you knew? So before, a prospective student comes and gets stuck in this awful profession, just kidding. What is something that you wish you knew before you came? Maybe we can start with the students, maybe Latif or Charisse, would one of you like to attempt to answer that question?
Okay, I can go first.
Okay.
So I will start with the first question about two things I've done. The first one is about the element of time. I think Irvin did mention in his presentation about how time is a very important aspect for our design, especially in landscape architecture. So short-term wise, you can kind of see like maybe the change in water level when it's flooding, or like the change in seasons, you can see different colors involved. So long-term wise, you can actually see like the change in vegetation, the vegetation becoming more lush, or like the biodiversity is returning. So these are actually the changes in time the project is about. And so the project doesn't really end once the construction of the project is done. So you can see how it evolves. And I think that's the beauty about landscape architecture. So it's also about thinking about the future, about how we can fit solve the challenges currently you are facing, but also design for the future. And I think that is a very important lesson for us as landscape architects to think about the future and to play with time in our design. So does Latif want to share more, or I can go on to the second one?
Just go
Okay,
on.
so the second
Keep going.
The second point I wanted to share more is about more about student life. Like we can always think about how design is like quite straightforward. When we're reading through books, architecture books, they show like so the architecture thought about the design this way, and then poof, the construction appears, like the project's done. But for us, I think as students, it's very important to understand that designs actually take time. So we actually go through a lot of sketching process. We go through understand how the context is about, and we have to work within limitations, but at the same time we also have to be creative. So because of this, it actually takes a lot of time. So we speak to our professors about our projects, and also ask our peers like how can we improve. And with these feedbacks, there's also a lot of constant revisiting and polishing up of our ideas. So this actually takes a lot of time, and I hope that the students here, prospective students, can understand that it is not like a very straightforward design process, but we also we can take like 3 steps forward but 1 step backward. So we will still improve, but it takes time and it's not very straightforward for students. Yeah. Okay, Latif, you can move on to your part.
Well, I was just gonna say, I mean,
okay,
I think that's a really, really good point, but it doesn't mean that it's all negative, right?
Yeah, no, I think that is the fun part actually, because you actually spend a lot of time thinking about your project and how you can improve, and you speak to your friends, they give you different ideas and different point of views that you have actually never thought about. So that's actually the fun part, like polishing up and slowly becoming better.
No, that's a really good point about studio culture, is that you're always learning from your peers. And when I was a student, my favorite part was talking to my colleagues and classmates to understand where they were coming from. And I think that you learn more from your peers than your actual professor. Don't tell other professors, but you do learn a lot from your peers. Great. Latif, would you like to take a stab?
Yeah, so the first thing out of the two things that I learned about landscape architecture in NUS is our adaptability to scale. So yeah, I've been in the NUS program for a little over 1 semester, but because of my polytechnic background, so I went through 3 years of diploma in landscape architecture. So we did play around with scale when we were in diploma, but when the first semester came rolling in, so our site was actually NUS itself. So it is almost designing for us as a student and also anyone who is in NUS. So that's where like the adaptability to scale comes in. NUS is quite a big site if you consider the entire school itself, but you have to also consider the smaller details. So like what Prof. Irvin said just now about how we also design for almost a human scale, so like comfort in terms of like seating, shelter and everything. So these are like kind of like when you move into your design, what I learned is that you sort of have to like one day think about the entire site, like how do you get from like business school to design school. But then the very next day when you're thinking about the route, you have to think about, oh, like the small shade like of the people walking. So you have to like always be adaptable to think about smaller details, but at the same time looking at the bigger picture so that you don't really run away from what your actual intent is. So I think that is one thing that I learned. And the second thing that I learned is that in landscape architecture, I think context is very, very important. So we are not always very lucky to get a very clean slate plot of land where you can just design from scratch and your client knows exactly what they want. So sometimes, so for our last semester, we did retrofitting of sites. So literally working with whatever that we had. So that was the NUS campus, which is something that has been around for like close to half a century. So that is something that, you know, we have to work around, and, you know, there are limitations, but I think that's the best part about it. Like, you don't just get a clean canvas and you just don't get to design whatever you want. You have to think about what is already there, how people are going to experience it, and you have to think about what are the cultures and what are the norms that are already in place. And I think that's the very exciting part about landscape architecture, is that you have all these different I wouldn't say limitation, I would say it's like, if you think about it in a good positive way, right, it actually sets the tone for whatever you are trying to implement. So I think that's a great thing, and that's what I learned from landscape architecture also in NUS.
Maybe I can just jump in here for a second. I think one of the big differences that the students mentioned would set us aside from either the fine arts disciplines as well as the engineering and hard science disciplines. The first of them is that we are constrained by realities on the ground. Unlike fine artists, you know, you can do a sculpture in any form. There's no limitation, right? And in engineering, there is a fixed answer to a fixed problem. Most of the time, I mean, not necessarily all the time, but there's a fixed answer to a fixed problem. In design fields, that is not so certain, right? There is never a true right or wrong. It's just how much more right are you than you are wrong, right? And the students who have gone through our quiz sessions will know every single solution is not a perfect solution. There's no such thing, right? It's just how much closer you are towards a good solution as opposed to something that is obviously bad solution, right? And that's really one of the big differences between us and our kind of these two neighboring disciplines that we usually talk about.
Thanks for jumping in. And I also just want to point out something that Latif mentioned, which was this idea of multi-scalar thinking. And so, Latif, you're only in your first semester or just finished your first semester. By the time you get to MLA, my students in the studio right now are working with the entire Mekong River as a project site, right? And so how do you reconcile the comfort of sitting on a bench with these sort of large scale natural systems is one of the things that we pride ourselves in trying to resolve. We haven't found a solution, but we are attempting to do that, and it's definitely part of the process. Great, thank you. Kenya, would you like to share about what you think what are three things that landscape architects or students should know?
Sure. Okay. So the first point I think that all landscape architects should know is about the construction industry is the biggest contributor of CO2 emission. So our profession is actually part of that family that has a huge impact to the planet. So what we do and our responsibility to the society, our responsibility to the environment is actually much bigger than we think. So we should all be aware of that, about that, and then think actively to act sustainable way. I think my second point is linked to that point, the first one. So landscape architects need to know that designing outdoor spaces and implementing your design idea to the real site is a development. Unfortunately, so construction process might include, a lot of excavation of the earth, cutting a lot of trees, and maybe disrupting the local ecosystem. However, we are the ones who can mitigate such disruption. So we are neither an environmentalist who advocates that, we should not do anything, and nor a developer who often prioritizes, efficiency of the development. So we stand actually in the middle as a mediator to find the right balance between the two. So positioning within these different types of stakeholders is something that we should all know about. So the third point is actually something fun. I think all landscape architects need to be sensitive to topography, right? So just like Irvin mentioned, we deal a lot of outdoor spaces, vast outdoor spaces, right? So therefore, topography is actually something that forms the basics of our design exploration. So, well, I feel all we all should have a hobby that allows him or her to experience the topography in greater detail, such as, let's say, golf, or mountain climbing, or running, etc. I think it was only when I was climbing, Mount Kinabalu in Malaysia that I noticed that, for example, the change in vegetation and it becomes totally bare surfaces as you go greater up toward the altitude. We should all know the powerfulness of topography and how it defines, the ecology and hydrology, and even our settlement patterns. I think those are the three things I think all landscape architects should know.
That's really fun. It reminds me of what Charisse was talking about earlier about different scales of time. And here I think we can add geological time, right? How do landforms shape? How did the Himalayas, for example, become the Himalayas, and our relationship and experience to that kind of space. Fantastic. Thank you. Irvin, you want to conclude?
Yeah, so we're gonna wrap up. You need about 10 minutes left, but okay, so my three things. The first is we have to bring across the misconception that we are just the greening guys. We have to kind of break that stereotype that we have. And I'm not sure how to do that, to be honest, at a larger scale, but certainly the students that we have need to understand we are not the decorative greening people. Right, we go much deeper than that. The students, Charisse and Latif, for example, in my history and theory class, you will hear me dismissing superficial greening and kind of explaining how is it we got to a point whereby the landscape in between buildings is just devoid of any magic, right? And I'll talk about this magic in the third point. So that's something that we need to understand. We are not only the superficial greening guys. Actually, we are not the superficial greening guys, right? We go much deeper than that. We have a much richer history than that.
We have roots.
Yeah, exactly. The pun intended. Right? The second thing is that we talk a lot about how landscape architects can become the next driver for environmental change, but we cannot do this alone, right? It has to be a multidisciplinary approach. And again, that's the reason why again CD is formed, because we need to talk to engineers, we need to talk to hydrologists, we need to talk to ecologists and environmentalists, sociologists. We are at that kind of confluence as designers. So a term that I like to tell my students is that we know a little bit about everything, but not enough of anything to call ourselves anything other than designers. So we need to know a little bit about hydrology, engineering, and whatever, but we are not experts in any of these fields. We just know enough to talk to them, include them in our discussions, and use all their expertise in order to create something that will be a win-win for everyone. And the last point I want to have is where we talk a lot about science and scientific knowledge, but we still have a very deep artistic kind of background behind us. So I have this very strange dual function in which I teach you history and theory, which is what Latif and Charisse are currently undergoing with me. But I will also teach you very advanced techniques, right? And the two are not supposed to be different. It's not a binary thing. You don't just learn about theory and art history, but you just swap over to digital tools and just ignore everything. Right? They're supposed to blend together, and that's something I think is slightly missing. Some of the latest projects can be extremely efficient, but completely devoid of any kind of artistic value to it, any kind of mystery that we have in landscape architecture. And that's kind of like the thing I want to say. Okay, we have 7 minutes left. Do we have anything else that I can read, Dorothy?
No, I don't have additional questions for the panel, but I wanted to thank you for some of those insights and just sort of responding back to that. So I'm a landscape architect and my father thinks that I just plant trees. And so when I told him that my master's thesis was designing sewage treatment wetlands, he was very surprised and was like, oh, I didn't know that landscape architects dealt with sewage. So it is definitely a very broad-ranging kind of subject and discipline. And what makes it super interesting, like Irvin said, is that it's interdisciplinary. We collaborate and work with a lot of other professions, ecologists, engineers, architects, planners, urban designers. Our training is interdisciplinary and works at multiple scales. And what's really keeping us grounded is how complex and how interesting the projects that we engage in are. So we don't have a huge audience, and so there might be opportunities for some questions. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions or put them in the chat box and we can try to address them. It could be questions about the profession, about the program. We're more than happy to share more.
It's fine if you don't have questions. When I was in your place, listening to the program director then telling me about landscape architecture, I didn't have any questions, so I just was like, okay, yeah, this is what I want to do, and I applied for it. Right. We have about 5 minutes left. Let me just share my screen in case you missed it earlier. So if you want to find out more about landscape architecture and how we teach it in NUS, the first of which is live Instagram open studio. We will have this this coming Friday morning, 9:30 a.m. to 11 a.m. Kenya will be the one who will be running the studio together with our co-teacher, Abby. And it will be a behind the scenes talk, right? Exactly how the students work in the design environment, in the design studio environment, sorry. It's not our final studio space because there's a lot of renovations happening, but basically the idea behind it is to have a sneak peek at what happens in the design studio because it's such a big portion of the education here at NUS. On top of that, if you do want to speak to us, you want to come and look at some exhibits, you can sign up using the QR code on the right to one of the 8 sessions. Unfortunately, we cannot let you come in as you please. Please sign up for one of the 8 sessions and we can speak to you directly. One of us will be there, inclusive of some of the other faculty members that are not here. And of course, there'll be some students on the standby as well if you want to ask more sensitive questions that the tutor should not know. Lastly, if you want to reach out to us, again, Instagram, Facebook, we are there. You can reach out to us through our website as well. A lot of the information is available on the website, inclusive of some of the things that I just told you. Okay. And last but not least, if you are already going to leave us now, please fill in this survey that the university is asking us to put together so that we have an idea of where you come from and kind of what courses you're interested in. So with that, I thank you, and I will just leave it for any potential questions before we close.
We have 3 minutes, so 3 minutes of questions. Anyone?
Yeah.
No pressure. If not, you know, Latif and Charisse will just talk. Just kidding. You look panicked.
We can also mention about, there's a question about like what we wanted to know, what we wish to know before joining NUS and NUS as a whole. So I think for the students here, maybe it's good to check out like the programs NUS have. So it's not just about your major, so it's not just about landscape architecture. It's good to look into having minors or second major. And I think that is something that as a student, I wish I knew more about. And there's also language programs for us, or even some centers for future graduates. I remember they have programs for us to teach us about internships and interviews, like skills to learn from them. So I think these are very good opportunities NUS provides us with. So for the students here, it's good to find out more about all these programs and see how they can complement your major, which is landscape architecture, if you were to join us.
It's a very good point. Life is not just about landscape architecture, and I completely agree with that. Any additional thoughts from anyone? Latif?
I think, yeah, so adding to what Sherry said, so I am actually one of the few people in design that actually took a second major. So yeah, so I didn't want to take a minor, so I took a second major in a completely different field. But I think this is sort of like inspired by Prof. Dorothy herself. So I'm actually taking political science in FASS as my second major. Yeah, so I actually knew that I wanted to do policy making, and I just wanted to see whether or not it's viable for me to, take public administration and see. So as of now, it's actually quite copable. Like I'm able to cope with it. It's not that, I wouldn't say it's not that hard. It is kind of hard with all the readings, but I think it's if it's something that you really want to do, it's worthwhile doing it. You just have to plan out your time a bit more. And I think one thing that maybe we should all learn before joining university is to actually read effectively. I wouldn't say, I think everyone knows how to read. Is not, I find it kind of tough if you don't know how to read effectively, because there's a lot of readings. I think Prof. Dorothy and Prof. Irvin would know, because they're the one dishing out all our readings for us. So yeah, so this and pairing it with my political science readings, we don't get, I mean, I don't have the luxury of like reading it 3 times to understand. So reading it once and understanding it is kind of a good skill to learn before joining university, because even in design, you have to read a lot. So yeah, I think that's not something that we can run away from.
Those are all very good advice. Well, it is 12 o'clock. I want to thank the panelists for joining us and some very valuable information. I didn't know, Latif, that you are double majoring. That's exciting. And thank you to the audience as well for joining us today. We are here if you have any more questions. Irvin has put in the chat box a number of links and resources, and we look forward to seeing you at some point in the upcoming year. Thank you. Maybe I'll start with a question before other people jump in. What is the sort of most favorite aspect about teaching? What is your favorite aspect of teaching the BLAs? Like what are some qualities of your favorite students?
Well, ideally, having a lot of the good memory with my student, that having someone who has this brave and also more diverse way to know more. So its meaning is that it's because we all need a learn, and also we are here to learn more. So I think this is very important skill and an important attitude that I'm more like it. So what I can see is that if that kind of attitude you having it, then it's every moment you having some of the comment or peer communication, and also you read something and you see something, then this flexibility make you to learn more. So I can really see their improvement even in the 1 semester or even the 1 month or something, that I can still see that. So this is very important point that I also enjoy how they are really growing up from the very beginning to the end. And so I'm looking forward to this kind of student.
No, that's very interesting. And so it's a student that is self-driven and is asking almost difficult questions, right?
Yep.
Asking questions that are beyond what we are teaching. And I think that's really important in studios, right? Because studios are a self-driven learning process where you're learning not only from your instructor, but also from your peers. Great. Any questions from the audience? Don't be shy.
How many we having it in here? Like, are there any? Yeah, I can see many. I'm not many, but I can see someone. So yeah, please ask any question, then we are welcome to.
Maybe I'll follow up with a question. You mentioned in your presentation that we are now moving into an ecological age. And I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on that. What do you mean that we are entering an ecological age, and how is it that landscape architects would participate in this in a different way than, say, I don't know, an environmental engineer or an architect or an ecologist?
Yeah, so thank you for this question. So previously we were in the age that is a technology, and so maybe people more appreciate all this new technique and so the new way to develop, and the more toward this like expanding the knowledge and also to do something more and more, so product more and something. And then now we also, all of us is really worry about that our planet, and also now it's more toward this concern about what the environment look like in the future. And so that's a kind of the big common the interest in many fields. So within this like discipline, multiple discipline, that having this all the ecological concern, I think it's a landscape architecture has a very unique position. We are not really just only argue that we have to protect like what the ecology is saying it. I mean, we are not about that kind of position. We also see the value of some like human development, that they also, it has a demand anyway, demand to develop, and because of the accommodate all the people that coming from the rural area to the urban area. So there is a somehow something that we cannot really stop, but we still have to accept this kind of demand too. So then the landscape architecture has this unique position, that how to shape or how to make them to really reconcile together. So and also we have very powerful tool, not just only about the word or only about the text and or only about the like saying, criticize or something. We have our ability to really shape, like meaning is we are able to visualize and we are able to dream with this space related the outcomes. So that is something that more direct action that we can suggest to the policymakers. And so I think this is fascinating and getting more the important role. I believe that the younger generation has a more opportunity that how you gonna doing this field.
Yeah, no, that's actually really interesting. Sorry, this is turning into an interview of our program director, but I think that is really interesting, because what you're saying is that the profession actually needs to expand beyond simply private practice or in the public sector or academia, but you're actually envisioning how our graduates would then go on and perhaps take on other roles that are advocating for the environment or advocating for other aspects of society. Beyond sort of traditional forms of practice. And so that's quite exciting. It's kind of an exciting time to be there. You had something to add?
So that's a really good point. That I really like to looking forward to this role, that it's not just about this defined role that we're having it. So we are the person that, I mean, we are the like program that we can really shape our field, that what can be done in the future too. So Dorothy, do we need to introduce other people in this room?
Sure. I mean, we're running ahead of schedule, which is why I'm not
sure.
time. I think it's a very important conversation to have, especially since we have you here.
That's great.
On that note, maybe we should move forward and take Yunhei off the spotlight. Anyway, for those of you that are joining us, my name is Dorothy Tang. I'm an assistant professor at NUS, and I also teach in the Landscape Architecture program. We're going to start a panel discussion, and we have plenty of time because Yunhei was so good at keeping on time with her presentation. And joining me on this panel, we of course have our program director, Associate Professor Huang Yunhei. We have Dr. Terrence Tan, who is also teaching with us in the NUS programs. And then we have Wayne Tan and Elaine Gallopon, who are both students in our BLA program and representing sort of different pathways of coming into the program, joining us. So maybe what I can do is, let's start by perhaps going around the Zoom room and introducing ourselves and sharing a little bit why you decided to become a landscape architect or to work with this medium of landscape. And I'll share first. So My background, I have a BLA, a 5-year one actually, so much longer than what you will have to go through. And I practiced in New York City for a number of years before pursuing an MLA. I later then turned to urban planning for my PhD because I was really interested in more interdisciplinary approaches to thinking about landscape. However, the reason I'm still practicing and teaching in landscape architecture is because one of the things that struck me early on when I was looking at different programs was how landscape is an inherently public medium. Whether land is publicly owned or privately owned, it kind of doesn't matter because the systems like water, like air, and all of these other components don't respect legal boundaries. So everything to a certain extent is part of the public realm. And I felt that was very important to participate in a profession that imagined the future of the public realm. And so that's what one of the main motivations that I have for staying with landscape architecture as a profession. So maybe we can move on. Terrence, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more what you're interested in or why you are in landscape?
Still wondering why.
Yeah,
I'm Terrence. I'm a senior lecturer in NUS, Department of Architecture. And I actually don't have experience in LA. Yeah. So I was from architecture. And after getting my master's, I read my PhD in the Department of Building in NUS. And that was when I started to look at the landscape in terms of greenery and how it can improve the environment. Yeah. So I've been doing research for like 10 years before signing up to be a faculty member here. Right. So my interest is really on greenery and how it can be part of our design solution to improve the environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think Terrence, or Dr. Tan, Terrence represents a really important aspect of our program, which is that it is interdisciplinary, right? We don't hate architects, we actually like them. And I think that it's important for us to think through multiple aspects of the profession. And it's technology, even though we're moving beyond technology to a certain extent, but I think technology is still an incredibly important medium that we work with, right? And Terrence, you had a really great story when I first met you about how you decided to look at greenery after, why would you look at something that is living after looking at buildings and systems and really boring mechanical things?
I forgot. Okay. Yeah. I think the way architecture was taught is quite similar to landscape architecture, except that we deal with buildings, and concrete, glass, and all that. And I sort of couldn't feel it anymore. Yeah, we always wanted we always start with wanting to design for people, design for people around us, for the environment. Yeah. So gradually, we realized that maybe the environment really should take center stage. And we want to consider the environment first. Yeah, the people first before we propose any solutions. Yeah. And I guess I was fortunate enough to be a part of looking at the scientific aspect of things. So there was some validation there. Yeah. Being very, very skeptical about things kind of helped, right? So that when you see results, you kind of know, okay, if I design this way, I will have this kind of results. And if the result is intended to improve the conditions around us, then the next step really is to make it part of the design solution.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that I think is really important about Terrence's work in teaching, which is to say, hey, let's not just make claims about what greenery does. Let's also look at the facts and the science and make sure that we are doing sort of evidence-based design rather than just speculating. Because I think that for a while, there was a lot of speculating on what green could do. And now we have a lot more evidence for that. Thank you. Let's we're going to come back to you, Yunhei, don't worry. But maybe we can move on to Wayne. Could you share a little bit about who you are and why you decided to join the landscape program?
Hi. So my name is Wayne. I'm currently in BLA's year 1 program. Just very the initial thought of me joining landscape architecture was actually I just wanted to study. Okay, that was the most basic reason. I want to study something design related because that's all I could do in poly. Back when I was in poly, I was doing visual effects, so it is a completely different field to what I'm studying now. Yeah, back then it was just about wanting to study design in a different field, and I didn't want to continue visual effects simply because it's so fake. Yeah. But of course, my goal kind of changed the more I sort of like with the more lectures I go to, and then my thought of studying landscape architecture sort of changed. I realized how impactful all these sustainable works can be and how it can help the future generation. Recently we've been doing something with regards to a study on the documentary Home 2009 film, where it is a documentary talking about how the Earth is deteriorating over time and how humans have sort of used these resources, overly used these resources, and how the thought of how landscape architects could sort of help impact counter the climate change. It's kind of what I'm trying to sort of explore. Yeah, so it is interesting because you get to know a lot about your role as a landscape architect. Yeah.
Very ambitious. Climate change. You're gonna fix climate change for us. Just kidding. Yeah, no, I think that what you bring up, Wayne, is really important, which is that climate change and all these sort of ecological threats are incredibly important, but it's also thinking about how it impacts society. And a lot of our studios and classes are really set up to address those issues. So thank you for sharing. I'd like to move on to Elaine. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit why you decided to be a landscape architect?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Elaine. I'm currently in my 3rd year of study in landscape architecture at NUS. I'm actually coming from a background, similar background. So I actually studied a diploma in landscape architecture. So how I chanced upon landscape architecture was actually through a photography competition when I was in my secondary school days. So I was keen on doing something related to arts, design, and mostly something in a related field. So I went to join this landscape architecture photography competition, and that's where I got to learn more about landscape architecture and got me really interested in the study. So what they work on, like not just the design aspect, but also on how they deal with people, the nature, and everything, and how everything comes in together in a more deliberate manner. So I studied diploma in landscape architecture and practiced for 2 years before coming back to study a bachelor in landscape architecture. So I'm still very keen and interested on like designing for people and how our design can impacts how certain people or the environment come together in a more harmonious way. So I really believe that landscape architecture could play a more crucial part in like the planning or the earlier stages of within the industry. Because coming from 2 years of experience prior to joining BLA, I actually learned from both like the consultant side and the contractor side, and they both had very different perspectives on their concerns when approaching a project. So I thought that, rather than it being more like an afterthought, it could actually be a more active role in the earlier stages rather than a later part of the stage. Yeah.
No, that's a really great point, Elaine. If we look at the the trajectory of landscape architecture as a profession in the past 20 years, I would say that more and more landscape architects are becoming prime consultants and coordinating large-scale projects than before, because what we're realizing is that if we neglect natural systems at the outset of the project, then we actually lose a huge opportunity to work with natural systems rather than trying to solve them as or thinking of them as a problem, right? And so this is one of the really exciting things about landscape architecture at the moment, which is that we're no longer, well, it's not that we don't think of ourselves, that we've never been an afterthought, but I think landscape architects are becoming more and more visible in shaping the original ideas about how urban development should occur, rather than just simply coming in the end and planting ornamental plants and things like that. So part of the training at NUS is really to think through what those systems are and how we can begin to understand how that impacts our daily life. So thank you for that. Yunhei, we're back to you. Why did you decide that you wanted to be a landscape architect?
Yeah, well, again, my name is Yoonhae. I'm leading this program, and also my starting point. I mean, I'm teaching the studio, design studio, and also I'm teaching the research dissertation module in the master program too. So when I start, I mean, oh my gosh, like 25 years ago, maybe. I mean, that's a time that we determine. I mean, the most of the people after they graduate from the high school, that's the first time they determine that their the path or career. So that time it was not really. I mean, we don't have this kind of website and all this like a lot of the flooding information about what kind of discipline we're having in the university. So we just have this like a few. We just know medicine and also law, and also we have something. So I thought that I was a little bit more in the art. So I was in the this is very natural kind of the kind of the process that I was in the art school in high school and middle school too, because I was good at these things. So that's kind of starting, and then after that, surely the bachelor program that we pursue is most of the art student from the art school is going to this art, so art related things. So I was in the art related the subject, and also the degree that in the university. But I know that it's my kind of the interest is not just about my own art or something, expression of my feeling or something, but more toward this the public, and also more toward the outdoor related work, because I was really outdoorsy girl, and so I was always Girl Scout and hiking and mountain and camping and all the things. So a little bit more closer to this nature too. So probably that makes me, and also I was more sensitive in this environmental issue and all the things. So that makes me to determine that after graduate from the bachelor, I determined to be in some of the environment related design or something. So that I was in this kind of things, and then I happened to having a collaboration with someone who is a landscape architecture field. So because there was some design task that having this, so that I immediately found that that's my field. So then after that I pursued the master with the landscape architecture. There's a time that I first know what's the landscape architecture, and then found that that's really suit for me. So I was educated in the MLA in Korea and the MLA in the US. So the both was in there, and then after that was I practiced in after MLA in the Korea, I practiced in the public housing landscape. So that's first part that I having it. So that time has a lot of the work for the public housing, and so all the landscape practicing is about that. And then after I immediately pursued this master, again another master in the US, and I happened to join in NUS. So that time is a starting point of that I get into this research and also the education. So that's a point, that's a kind of career path for me. The reason I see that why this is fascinating is because the landscape is not static. I mean, they are growing, and they are also like having a lot of this saving nature. Also, it's ethical always ethical issue that connected. So, and also I like that kind of the definition of that the city as a ecosystems. So my field and my role in here is also how to make people to nurture in that sense, as well as the how to make because I have a both experience in practice and also this academia. So I try to make this theory or the academia, which coming from this urban ecology to the connected to this practice in more design. So that there are some of the gap between this theory in the practice. So I try to minimize, or I try to reduce this gap. That's what I'm trying to do it.
Right. I think that is that it's really interesting how you went through so many different iterations before you arrived. But it sounds like a story that all of us can kind of relate to as well. But I think one thing that you bring up, which is kind of a thread through all of the panelists today, is that there's a sense of idealism in the work that, you know, we won't be able to save the world. Like, Wayne, you can't save climate change. But at the same time, there is a sense that we want to contribute about thinking and imagining a better world, not just for the generation, but for ourselves as well. But no, that's really fascinating. I'm going to move on to a next set of questions. I was wondering if each of you could share sort of 3 things that either every landscape architect should know, or something that you have learned while you've been here as a student. And what do you think, you know, what is one thing that you wish you knew before you became a landscape architect? So maybe we can start with let's start with, sorry, Terrence, you're just like next on my Zoom screen. So I'm gonna pick on you. Maybe Terrence, you can start. I know you're not a landscape architect, but I was wondering, what are some things that you think we should know? 3 things.
3 things. Why don't I just say one thing?
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
It better be a very important thing.
Yeah, I think, yeah, because of my background, yeah, I would say maybe I would just try to add on to what Wayne talked about earlier, that he was doing VFX, right? And a lot of what I've been thinking about, right, is that how pictures have been too pretty these days. Yeah, to the point where it's not that there's not enough representation, there's a lot of misrepresentation of what the environment can be like. Yeah. So a very straightforward example is when you have renderings of new developments, you see someone exercising in the afternoon, you know, in the tropical sun. Yeah, and that doesn't happen. Yeah, you get a heat stroke. Yeah, or you know, you have like a crazy amount of greenery on your wall. Yeah, and there is no planter box to support it, although it looks really good. You know, it is more VFX, right? Yeah. So yeah, just thinking back, I think it was that we're churning out so much graphics that we kind of start questioning whether, you know, is this gonna work? You know, the whole idea of improving this space. Yeah. And my idea or my representation of it, is it accurate? Yeah. So what really was lacking is the numbers. And in some way, this course really, we try to design with numbers so that things make sense. Yeah, we try to understand the context, the climate, and what kind of results we get with the intervention that we're proposing. Yeah. So if there's one thing that I think students who are interested to join us should have, is to prepare to design in many ways. So it's not just having the skill to produce a nice rendering. It's also like designing with different methods, different tools, like how do you design with Excel? You know, how do you design with numbers? Yeah, looking at the demographics, looking at the proximity between people and animals, looking at the traffic network. Yeah, how do these all factor in so that your design essentially creates more value, right, than before? Yeah. So of course, the technicalities are maybe quite boring. Yeah, but the idea is that there are many ways of doing it. and you need to be open to ideas. Yeah. And as long as you're open, you're willing to learn, I guess we're willing to teach.
That's a good point. I like a lot of things about what you just said, but most importantly, I think it's important to remember that as designers, we're not simply seeking out one solution or the best solution to an issue or even a problem. It is really about thinking of multiple ways of achieving a goal or addressing an issue, and that everyone in the room might come up with a different solution or a different approach. And that is not to say one is right or wrong, it's just different. And they probably have different goals, they have different objectives. And one of the things that we emphasize quite a bit in our program is how do you determine what those goals and objectives should be? How do we begin to think about them realistically through the numbers? How do we begin to look at Excel and be realistic about our projections? But at the same time, not think of our work as the only solution to a larger issue or complex problems. The second thing that I really appreciate about what you just said, Terrence, is this idea that sometimes the drawings that we make and the representations are not realistic because we might lie a little bit. There's a great book about how you lie with maps, right? And so anything that we produce, we have to be very critical of like, what is the content and what is it saying about either our work and so on and so forth. And so one way to avoid that is being grounded in the technologies that are essential to thinking about the built environment. But another thing is just being critical and learning how to be visually literate. And that's another aspect of our program that we spend a lot of time on, is how do we read a drawing? How do we make a drawing, whether it is a plan, a section, a rendering, a movie, a fly through, and being careful and deliberate about what we make and what we present to the world. And there's a lot of, so this is where history and theory, as well as the practical aspects and technical aspects of our program, come hand in hand. Great. So maybe we can move on to Yunhei. What are your thoughts? What are 3 things that you think that every landscape architect should know? You're muted.
Sorry about that. So yeah, the landscape architecture, again, as I mentioned in the very beginning in this overview of the program, when we are asked to define our field, and also when you are asked to define what is the landscape itself, is there are a lot of variation and a lot of I mean, it's not really one single the definition. So maybe it's to follow up the Dorothy's point about this, like we don't have one single answer and something. So we have a lot of diverse kind of way to see us. So what I can say, maybe it's what first things I want to say about what is landscape architecture know it, is that landscape is very flexible, and also they have they are really regarded as a boundary object. So many people really define this is boundary object. So maybe to give a more direct answer is no direct example is that the landscape is sometimes it's a science, like can quantify and also can evaluate and can measure, and then the other part is that we can sense and we can visualize, and so we have these 2 senses, like science to design and design to science. So that we already hold these 2 brain. So I'm just want to say about that. The landscape is a boundary object. I think this is something that we all landscape architects should know and also should consider. Any type of the project and any scale of the project we do it, we should think of this multiple aspect of the landscape that we're having it. So that's the first one. And the second one is our role is really expanding. So compared with my time, I was educating my master degree program in how many years ago? So there, and now what I'm teaching to the BLA student, completely different. It's really changed a lot. So it means it's different from the architecture. Maybe architecture has a somehow traditional way to still keep this classic component that always say something, but whereas this our field is there are a lot of the, because we are boundary object. So the meaning is there is always have some external force that we work together. So environmental issue also going to be changed, and also that this technology and knowledge and skill sets always change. So that this our working scope and our task is always change, and the demand maybe change. So we probably need this very flexibility, and also very need to expanding our role as many as possible and as much as possible. So all of these things is it sounds very challenging, but also it makes us to be unique. So I think the positioning of our field also is depending on our the generation, and each generation has a different things. So that's one thing that I want to say as a second point, expanding the role of our field. And third one is, as I mentioned previously, that what's the differences between the other discipline and us is that scales that we are talking is we are not just only talking about spatial scale. So spatial scale means it's like a variety of the scale that we talk, and also temporal scale. So we may see of that it's the lifespan of the whole entire primary forest, like which 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years, and so probably this much larger. I mean, all the scale that we talk at spatial scale and temporal scale are much larger and broader than the other design disciplines. So because of that unique characteristic of our field, we also having many opportunities that how we shaped our field and how we designing too. So yeah, that's the third thing that I want to say.
Great. I feel like you should just write a book. I have nothing else to add. It's such a fantastic, those are such important conceptual issues that I think landscape architects need to address. And so thank you for sharing that. Okay, so what we're all really anticipating, I was wondering, Elaine and Wayne, could you share what are some things that you have learned while you've been at NUS, and what are some things that you wish you knew before you joined? Who wants to go first? What's that?
Wayne said that he'll go first.
Okay.
Fine. Okay. Actually, yeah. So I think one of the things I recently learned about how landscape architect works is that the design reflects the expression of the site works as a reflection of the designer. So is because we have been doing a lot of concept designs for land art, and actually it is, although landscape architects do talk about sustainability and environmental climate change whatsoever, there's also an expression of art that is involved with designing. So for example, like you could interpret this design as let's say expression A, or you can interpret this design as expression B. You know, it's really up to the users of the site to really kind of like it is up to their senses to see how they want to interpret a site. That's my opinion. Secondly, I did like when we consider designing for landscapes, you kind of want the design to not only function as an aesthetic appeal, but also to function as a self-sustaining ecosystem. So how do certain species of plants, animals, insects work together in harmony to sort of create that self-sustaining site? You know, because landscape, we are also not dealing. We are not just dealing with the design. We are also dealing with how we are also dealing with time aspect of it. So how a site changes over time will really depend on the base framework of our design, and that's our job lah. And I think maybe one thing before I came in, I would like to know about was basically how, you know, it's not just about it's not just about really producing nice work like what Dr. Terence said. Is really to consider the relationship between the interrelated elements of design. Yeah, so that's my few pointers.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. We often talk about landscape architecture as like a savior profession, but really there is also something that's really important, which is how we interface, how our work interfaces with daily lives of other people and the value that it brings to that. And sometimes we talk about how aesthetics and function are almost these sort of two polar opposite components, but they aren't. Really, I think a really well-designed landscape merges the two, and that is one of the things that brings value to society. So that's a really good point. And yes, Wayne, everything is connected. So, so understanding how that all operates is extremely important. Excellent. Elaine, would you like to share?
Yeah, so so some of two things that I've learned so far. Maybe the first one would be picking up on what our profs have mentioned earlier. It's more of research-based design within the practice of landscape architecture. How landscape architecture could be quantified rather than just the aesthetic aspect of it. So as a student and as someone who was initially keen on joining the course with an arts or arts and design background that I was keen on learning, it was relatively new to me trying to quantify design, reading more and trying to research and review a lot more things and try to base my design off of studies, like factual studies as well. And so it's relatively new to me, but I also learned that there are certain things that is very hard to quantify, such as maybe emotions or memory or culture. Like the human aspect of it is I felt very subjective. And oftentimes it's also very hard to explore. You really had to do a lot of engagement with people, which is something that we have been doing in our current studio. They are prompting us to actually meet the people and understand from their perspectives why they do or why they feel certain things and what matters more to them. Like, for example, within a neighborhood context, and the elders and the children, they might have different perspectives and views coming from the ground as users of the design. But as designers or landscape architecture students or practitioners, we might have certain ideologies, certain ideas based off research that, certain things might be good for a certain group of people, but for them, they might perceive it in a different way. So it's the difference between design intention and the user experience is something that I learned. Another thing that I learned from landscape architecture. And yes, and it evolves over time. So really, it's like from children to elderly, they might have different concerns, and it's not just the human aspect, but also nature continues to change over time as well. So being a landscape architect or designer, something that I've learned was that you can't deal with things at a constant level, but you have to perceive how it would change over time. And maybe one thing that I wish I knew that the design before entering uni was how much freedom I had doing design work. Yes, because coming from a diploma background in a similar field, it was the design module structure was somewhat more rigid. They had like, for example, we were tasked to do a certain task like water framework or WSUD, water sustainability and such. So everyone will try to study the same topic. But after joining NUS, I I noticed that the design module structure is actually very free. There's a lot more it's a lot more open-ended in a sense where we can choose our own focus topics despite given like a very an idea what we can do. Like for example, in our first design module was retrofitting. A lot of us actually explored different topics. Retrofitting could be retrofitting hydrology, topography, or maybe even just the playscapes or small in between green spaces. Everyone was allowed to choose and explore things that they found interesting. So I wish I knew that it wouldn't be so direct. It's very open-ended, and it was something that was beneficial for me as a student as well, because I could test out certain ideas and theories that I've learned in other modules, like maybe for history and history and theory, and maybe introduction to landscape architecture. There's a lot of topics that we went through and that we learned over like the more contextual part of the modules that we had. And at the same time, the design aspect was something where we could explore all the ideas that we thought of. So I thought it was very interesting as a student. It's also very challenging at the same time. Yeah.
Yes, thanks for sharing that. I feel like you should be just the spokesperson for our program, because everything that you just said are some of the major goals that we have for the program. The first is that design is not something that exists in a vacuum, right? It exists in different kinds of contexts. And so what you and Wayne were talking about was, how do we read and interpret sites? How do we interact with users? What do we base our designs on? It's not just pulling things out of thin air. It's not crumpling a piece of paper and throwing it on a model, right? But there are both social, cultural, economic and technological basis for interventions in the landscape. And the second thing that I really enjoyed about what you just said, Elaine, is this idea that, you know, we don't have set solutions. And one of the critical things in our BLA program is, how do we train students to think independently, right? And to question the parameters that are given, and be innovative, because innovation is not, again, pulling things out of thin air, but it's about thinking critically about the parameters, about what our world looks like at the moment. And it's not, again, not a free for all, but something that imagines a better future. And so that requires that we have parameters, but the parameters are meant to be broken. The BLA program is set up as an experimental laboratory, really, for design and for the use, experimenting with different theories and technologies. So thanks for, like I said, you could be the spokeswoman for our program. That's all the things that we designed. Everything that we designed the program to do.
Vetted by everyone. I mean, it's experimental, but trust us, we know what we are doing.
We have a rough idea, and the profs are always there to somehow guide us.
We are there to comment.
Yes. When we get lost.
Well, like I said, it's a learning process. Sorry, Terrence, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe in view of the potential audience, right? JC students, yeah. So the note about freedom, yes, but freedom is a double-edged sword. You may have too much freedom, and maybe some people are not comfortable with that, you know. Yeah, especially JC students who in their syllabus tend to have the questions, and also they actually have the answers already, right? Yeah. So when they are operating in an environment where you don't even have questions, right? Like, define your own brief. Yeah. It takes a while to get used to. Yeah. But it also is a training of the mind, right? I remember when I first came in, we were drawing lines and tasked to design something, you know, and everything was really more or less based on our own appeal towards form, right? Yeah, but after a while, you start to realize, you know, you look a bit closer, look around you, there are things that matter, and it's up to you to champion those things, right? And through the course of 4 or 5 years, you'll find that, you'll gravitate towards certain issues. For me, it was education, and greenery. But for you, it can be anything else. But this program really helps us to, gives us the time to nurture our own interests and our skills to address issues that we feel are important.
Well said. You can also be the spokesperson.
Can I write a book also?
You can be the spokesperson next year. Even though you're not a landscape architect.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Well, we have a few more minutes. I was wondering if either the panel or the audience, if there are any questions or additional thoughts before we close.
Dorothy, do you have any additional point that what landscape architects should know? I'm curious that do you see anything is missing or anything you need to say more or something? So probably also better to having your view too.
I wasn't supposed to be interrogated, but okay. I'll share a couple of quick thoughts. The first thing I think that landscape architects should know is that policy matters. We don't talk about politics or policies a lot in studios or in some of our courses, but at the end of the day, the policymakers are at the beginning of the process. They're the ones that set an agenda, right? And so I think it's really important for designers in all stripes, landscape architects, planners, and so on and so forth, to participate in conversations about policy, because that has a direct impact on funding, social, economic kind of structures that we work within, and how we can implement something. So being not political in this sort of North American way, but political in terms of understanding how governments and agencies work, is also a very kind of fun aspect and something that I think every landscape architect should know. The second thing I think every landscape architect should know is how to work at multiple scales. We talked about this quite a lot, multiple scales, multiple temporalities, right? So from, when it rains, it could be a 5-minute event, but then there's also geological processes that take millions and millions of years, to designing a bench and how you design a bench so that it is comfortable, and thinking through like what the nuts and literally what the nuts and bolts are that create this thing. So I'm teaching a studio right now that is looking at the entire Mekong River, and how we begin to design completely at a regional scale. And so one of the challenges, I think, for landscape architects is to not be confined within a scale, and to learn to work at these multiple scales. And then the last thing that I think is, I think every landscape architect should know, is that I think we need to move outside the confines of our own discipline a bit. I've been teaching a course that's been looking at things like ecofiction as a source for inspiration. And so we should participate in different cultural activities or art or other aspects of society that are also productively envisioning what our futures could be, not in a dystopian sense, but in an optimistic sense. So those are my 3 thoughts.
Okay, yeah, that's great. So I mean, now my daughter is kind of beginning to search the university because she's already that age. So now I also can see that what is or think of that what's gonna be professions or educations in the future. Probably in 10 years or 20 years time, it may be not having this like defined one exact profession that you have to dedicate for entire like 20 or 30 years time. So it may be more like a variety of the aspect that or variety of the approach that we like it. Then meaning is you may have a multiple professions together or something. So I can see that this also kind of one of the opportunity as a person who really shaped the environment because we have this kind of ability to interconnect together. So what I want to say is that probably it's not really like this is kind of your lifelong kind of the choice for this. I mean, when you pursue the one kind of the degree in university, it's not really about that you choose the one thing that you can do it forever, but it's more like a starting point to think that what kind of things you can think and what's your critical point that what you are really explore. So I think that's something that is gonna be changed over time, and so the probably in the future, near future, that we are more in that sense, and then also we all as an educator or as a student now, the what you really think now maybe it's not really fixed one that we need to do is something. So I'm just looking forward to this change as well.
Yes, definitely. That's a really great note to maybe end the session, is this idea that while landscape architecture as a profession is established and there's a very specific career trajectory, but at the same time, what the BLA is really training students to do is to think beyond those professional boundaries and to start thinking about how we can participate in society in different roles, not just as professionals, to affect change. So thank you to all the panelists and the audience for being here. We're just a few minutes early, but I mean, it is Sunday afternoon and we all should get some rest. So I'm going to release everyone into the wild, and thank you so much for coming this afternoon. We appreciate it. Go back to the wild.
Yeah.